welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, I'm Jenn, and this is Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. And I'd like to introduce you to this week's guest. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book in your own words?
Hi, yes, I'm London Clarke, and that's actually my pen name. My real name is Megan, but for these purposes, London Clarke. And my book, Dunmoor, is a Regency horror, which is not something you come across too often, but I've been kind of calling it a in the spirit of Crimson Peak, or which is more Victorian actually, but either Crimson Peak or the Woman in Black. It's a kind of a lush Gothic horror, and a tale of generational curses, and it just happens to be set in England of 1818. So kind of a so showcasing a legacy of evildoers and with, of course, the Gothic house that has hauntings and shadowy figures and all of that sort of thing.
Great. So let's start, if that's okay, with the house itself. Dunmoor is an incredibly evocative place. You just describe it so well in the book, and it really takes on a character of its own, I think, as often the houses do so often in books like this. And I was wondering, what does it take to build, as it were, a haunted estate like this one? The setting is so rich, and I'm wondering, how do you imagine the house and how does it become a character in its own right?
Well, I think for all of my books, actually, I've tried to make the house a character. I really try to bring, I try to think of what would absolutely terrify me being in a house that is of this age and placement, and I try to bring those elements in. But for Dunmoor, it was actually based on Newstead Abbey, which is in Nottingham. It was Lord Byron's home. And so this one, I tried to use a lot of the historical details from that house, including like the cloister court and, the idea even that they were trying to dig for treasure around that area. All of that was kind of pulled from historical details of Newstead Abbey. And I just tried to basically make it Newstead Abbey with, elements of horror. It's really the best way to describe it, just to think like, what would really scare me about being alone in this house and bring those elements into it.
Nice. Yeah, I'm so surprised and delighted that you mentioned Byron, because when I was reading the book, I was reminded really strongly of Byron in the figure of the missing husband of our main character, Lady Helena. Is it Helena or Helena?
Helena.
Okay, Helena.
Yeah.
Was that something that you were consciously doing?
Yes, I have been for decades now. I'm obsessed with Lord Byron, and I have kind of incorporated his character into a lot of different things. But for this one, actually, this book started out, I started writing it back in 2016, and I put it away for a while because it was meant to be something else. It was just going to be a straight historical. It was just going to be kind of a take on his life. I was just going to fictionalize it and call him Lord Winters and go with that. But I went back to it a few years later, and by that point I was writing full-fledged horror, Gothic horror, that kind of thing. So I thought, no, I need to make this, it needs to fit in with my other books. So I went back through it and I basically made it, the scary brought in the scary aspects. But yes, Drake, the missing husband, is based on Lord Byron, and in book 2 we'll find out a little bit more about him and his past and that kind of thing. But he's definitely loosely based on the figure. He's just a wonderful, like, you know, Lord Byron just lends himself to tortured souls, you know, and even the way that he lived at Newstead Abbey was very Gothic, you know, and all of these myths that you hear about him and his family, you know, and a lot of the things from what I understand are very much true. So this is, yeah, it's just fodder. I mean, you know, this is where truth is stranger than fiction, and it's just great fodder for Gothic novels.
Absolutely. Byron is such an interesting figure, and he fits so well into this genre, I think, because he, like, simultaneously, he's a figure who's been really heavily romanticized, but also like that romanticized image has been pretty thoroughly deconstructed over the years. And I think you see a lot of that in Drake in your book, because he is this sort of like, you know, quixotic adventurer, romancer, lover type character. But he, you know, wreaks devastation in Helena's life, you know.
Yes. Yeah, and that was really the point. I didn't set out to make him like a hero, really. I wanted to show him as sort of this dark figure that she was, you know, even though she's married to him, and in that time period, you couldn't just get a divorce. That just didn't happen. You know, it was, you had to get special permission, and you had to fulfill certain things, like show, you know, that you were tortured, basically, or that they, you know, are in this particular case, historically speaking, Byron's wife did have grounds because of what, you know, he had been doing with his sister, and some other things that were, you know, on the horizon that they could bring up in court. But you know, it just wasn't that easy to get a divorce. So a lot of women just suffered through it, and just, you know, either tried to live apart from the abusive husband, or they, you know, or they, if they did have means and they were well off, and sometimes they would seek, you know, what's it's called, separation of bed and board, and they would live apart, but they were never allowed to marry again. It wasn't like you got to, you know, to go about your merry way. You were just basically like, okay, you had to take lovers or whatever you were going to do, you know, to make yourself happy. But basically, yeah, it just wasn't an easy go. So in this particular case for Helena, she's really kind of in a pickle, because, you know, she doesn't have, you know, she had the money to, you know, live without him, but reputation wise, all of those things, there's a lot of considerations that she just, you know, I don't know that she really wants to go through all of that, but I think once she meets Luke, she's kind of, you know, in that place of considering it, like, well, wouldn't that be nice if we could just go off and live somewhere together? So
it's really interesting to me, sort of just the complexity of the situation when she meets, you know, her new love interest, because her status as a sort of spurned wife, like, really throws her into this sort of like limbo where she's still married in the eyes of the law, and so she can't really move on with her life, and yet she's living by herself and is, for all intents and purposes, single, you know. And it really, like, it did a good job of illustrating, I think, the sort of marginalization, you know, that a woman in her precarious situation might encounter.
yeah, and actually, Lord Byron's wife pretty much lived like that. I mean, she just had to carry on, and she lived, you know, to a ripe old age. And even after Byron died, she never remarried, and she would have been able to do so at that point, but she never did. And I think a lot of women just, you know, at some point, maybe after a bad marriage, were kind of like, yeah, no thanks. I don't want to do that again. So she, you know, I think with Helena, although she's still young, and you know, this is just, I think, torturous for her to realize, like, now that she actually can feel the way that she does for Luke, and to be stuck in a situation where she doesn't have an option to really be with him at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a line, I think, toward the beginning that made me laugh and made me think about just the way in which, you know, the shape of our lives has changed so much since the Regency era. Because there's a line where I think Helena has just woken up and she's brooding about her situation. And she looks in the mirror and she's like, oh, I'm 24 and my life is already over. And I was like, oh gosh, like I wish I was 24, you know.
Yeah,
But
me
like in
too.
her time period, you know, and given her situation, she's not wrong, you know.
No, I mean, women mid 20s, I mean, it was pretty much, you know, if you were 25 and not married, you were looking at the precipice, you know. That's just there wasn't a lot of hope for women beyond that point, unless they just met someone that was older and was willing to, you know, take on an older wife, you know. But yeah, that I know it's funny for me to look at that too. But you know, and then of course with her sort of mentor friendship with Lucy, who's a little younger, but even Lucy at, you know, at her age at 22 or whatever, she's kind of also bemoaning the fact that she's, you know, not married and waiting to find that right person. So I think that was just kind of, you know, that was just every woman during that time period, that was really the only option that they had open to them, was to make a good match and to marry well. And you know, it wasn't like you could go out and just get a job and you know, except for the few women that became writers or things like that. But even they usually wrote under sort of a male pen name and that kind of thing. So there just wasn't a lot of option for women during that time other than to get married and, you know, have an heir.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about Helena and Lucy, individually and then together, because I think they're both really interesting characters. Something I noticed about Helena when I was reading is that there's a lot of ways in which she is a sort of classic Gothic heroine. She's very willful. She, you know, experiences these sort of like visions and experiences that she can't tell if it's her imagination or if it's something actually happening. But in other ways, she sort of subverts those tropes a lot, because she's very grounded and she's very scientifically and mathematically minded. She's really got like a good head on her shoulders. And I was wondering if those tropes were something that you had in mind while you were, you know, bringing her together as a character.
Well, I mean, I love the Gothic tropes, and I honestly, I mean, I grew up reading those novels, you know, of the like Victoria Holt and V.C. Andrews and all of it. I mean, I love all of those older ones. But you know, nowadays, you really, I mean, I felt I really needed to also give her something else, because she couldn't just be this, you know, woman that's the heroine in distress, and you know, that just doesn't fly nowadays, and it's irritating to people. So fortunately, Annabella Milbank, who was Lord Byron's wife, was actually very scientific and mathematic. She loved to do mathematical puzzles and to geometry, and you know, Byron called her the princess of parallelograms. So you know, that was her bent. And then their daughter actually was part and parcel of coming up with the modern day computer. So there is a real line. I mean, I was just like, yes, I can use this, and just to pull this in. And I plan that will continue into the next book to the whole mathematical aspect of it, even though I am completely not mathematical. I can't even tell you, I've done reading on math from the Regency that I would never ever do. Nor, but yeah, that's something that, but you know, I know that women in that time did have those abilities, and unfortunately they were minimalized because it wasn't thought that women really needed that, more than just to, you know, figure out how much you needed to pay your servants and that kind of thing. But otherwise, they were really more encouraged to, you know, do needlepoint and learn French and you know, that kind of thing. So that was considered to be more beneficial than science and math. But Helena, her father made sure that she got, you know, what he saw in her what he had in himself, which was this mathematical ability, and he really fostered that in his daughter.
Mm. And I think that, she compares really nicely to Lucy as a character because, there are some ways in which Lucy is sort of like the more stereotypical Gothic heroine because she, is a little bit more frivolous. She's a little bit more like dreamy and silly in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting because it feels like that, like the Gothic stuff is happening to her in a way while Helena watches, like it's very interestingly structured, I think.
Yes, Lucy came in because I felt that, first of all, Helena felt too lonely for me. When I first wrote this, she was by herself. And I just kept thinking, no, she needs someone in here that can sort of help her get in, because a lot of the things that Lucy entered into, Helena would never enter into those things and or ask those questions or say those things. So I needed someone else to be along that was, like you said, a little bit more stereotypical and kind of the foil for Helena. She's sort of the opposite that shows all of Helena's attributes a little bit more brightly, because Lucy has, some issues of her own, that she's boy crazy and desperate to find, this man that she can marry. And of course, right away kind of latches on to Luke Lennox. And, even though, and again, that's another one of those things that in her situation with her family and reduced circumstances, even though that would have been a dream situation for her to be, for this man to be interested in her, that wasn't the case here, because he's really interested in Helena. So there's that kind of push and tug and torment of Helena wanting to support her friend, but also, kind of wanting him for herself, even from the beginning, not really even realizing that she had those feelings for him.
Absolutely. Because she is a very loyal friend, and I think that it's an interesting friendship because it crosses these class boundaries, as you were just saying. But Lucy is a really good foil for her and a really good friend. And I think that watching Helena navigate that situation of wanting to honor her friend, but also acknowledge and honor her own feelings is a very interesting path to watch her walk while dealing with, everything going on in this haunted house.
Right. I know it's kind of a juggling act, because, you don't want to have these things go flat, once you've started them. But then I also had to, have to keep remembering, okay, but we need to continue the story of what's going on in the house and keep these other things up in the air. And, there's the stuff that's going on in Blackfriars Forest and the lake and all of these things that have to, kind of come together at some point. So, so it was definitely, this has been a more challenging book for me, because my other ones are all contemporary. So this was definitely one of kind of doing more of a juggling act of horror and history.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I guess that brings me to a question that I had, which is, what kind of research into the Regency era and into the sort of like Gothic genre did you do? Did you read other novels? Was there historical research? And I'm wondering what influenced you. I mean, you talked about Byron a little bit, but I was wondering if there was anything else.
Well, I love the Brontes. I love Jane Austen, quite honestly. And so I've read all the Brontes. I've read Jane Austen, and then I watch a lot of those BBC productions and try to really note what's what kind of setting and what's going on in the background and that kind of stuff. But also just I have since I was in college done extensive reading on Byron, actually, and on the women in his life. So a lot of the historical things I'll come across in the biographies, and then I can look them up, on other sources. But there are some great Regency sources for writers. The Beau Monde, which is part of the Romance Writers Association, and there's people that put stuff up that have boards specifically for for that era of that Regency era. And it's so really all of my information has come through there, and books that I've read over the years on Byron and his set.
Very cool.
There's plenty of info out there, and it's definitely, I mean, it's a fascinating time period. It's really my favorite time period, even though the Victorian time period is absolutely riveting, but there's something about the Regency that I love.
Yeah, it's just full of fascinating figures who were at once sort of living within the tight constraints of English society, but then also like pushing those boundaries in really interesting ways that I think is very essential to like who Byron was in particular.
Yes, definitely. And his fame came about kind of all of a sudden, and he was in the middle of basically what they called Byromania, because people just went nuts over him. He was like a rock star. So that just lends itself incredibly well to those dark, heroes in these types of novels. But I actually started out Dunmoor with his point of view in it. He was going to have a point of view. And then some early beta readers were like, I think it's too much. It's just too much. So I ended up taking that out, and was glad I did in the end, because I think it lends kind of some mystery to his character, where we don't see him, but we find out about him through, everybody else in the book who has known him. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that.
Interesting. So did you know, when you started this book, did you know that there was going to be another book in the series, or did you discover that as you were writing?
No, I discovered that as I wrote it. I got close to writing the end, and I went, nope, this is going to have to go over to another book. So yeah, that was not my plan at all. It was just going to be a standalone, and it ended up being, it's going to have one more. So
that's great.
Be out sometime in the spring, probably April or May.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that's so exciting. I can't wait to read it.
Oh,
good. So I have just a couple more questions about sort of like the Gothic horror in general. As you said earlier, generational curses are really important in this book. And I'm very interested in general in how things like cursed families and stuff like that act as metaphors for generational trauma and dysfunctional families. And Gothic horror so often features the flaws and the sins of elite families and the sort of the rot that exists under the polished surface of society.
Right.
And I was wondering if this was something that was on your mind while you were writing too.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. There's kind of metaphors within metaphors in this book, because there's a lot of allusion to the outside world kind of invading the inside, with the vines that kind of grow on the walls and the trees that are coming up through the floorboards. And so I kind of wanted to show that, no matter how hard they're trying to sort of make this house habitable for these kids that they're bringing in, it becomes pretty obvious that this is not going to be a quick fix. This is something that is so ingrained in this house, and the people that lived there before perpetrated such evil against children specifically, which is why it's kind of ironic then that Luke chooses this place to create an orphanage and a foundling hospital, because it's basically the worst possible place that he could bring these kids. So I did want to sort of show that, the winters, it started several generations ago, and it's now kind of bleeding over into other people who are moving into the house that have no relation to them at all, but just kind of how, I guess evil begets evil is sort of the thread that runs through here, because the winters, they were part of what the curse that was placed on this land, and that it has not gone away. It is not something that has magically disappeared just because the winters have disappeared. it's still there and it's still affecting everyone that comes into the house. So that's kind of that element that I wanted to show with, not only the generational curse, but also with the trees and all of those things that were growing kind of into the house. So, which, that again, that's one of those things that I think, what would really creep me out? I'm like, oh yeah, trees kind of growing up through the floorboards. That's so creepy. When you go into an abandoned house and you see that just like, whoo, that gives me cold chills. So
it's super creepy. Like all the things that creep you out creeped me out too.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Success.
This book was just full of so many really beautiful and really haunting images, like the vines and the trees. There's the scene where the birds sort of swoop into the room during dinner, and it's all really really striking, and those images stay with you. And I was wondering, do the images precede the story, or does the story dictate what sorts of hauntings happen?
It usually is. I'm kind of a pantser when I write, so I just start and I go and see what's going to happen. I don't know we'll see what happens here. But the birds came in as an idea as I was writing it, so they did not precede the story at all. I don't even remember how they came about, but just that I know the blackbirds tend to be a symbol of death, and so I knew death was coming, and these were going to be sort of the harbingers of that as they invaded the space of those people who were trying to actually create something good. That these birds that are maybe they're real, maybe they're not, but they come in really just to bring the messenger as messengers of get ready because it's coming, and so that they really were not, they did not precede the story. They were an outgrowth of the story, and honestly the trees were too. The trees did not come till a little bit later, and I decided to have them become part of the story too.
Now that we're talking about it, I'm kind of realizing that so many of the things going on in this book really speak to a lot of our most primal fears, because like there's nothing scarier than the haunted house, because your house is supposed to be your ultimate safe haven. It's supposed to be the only place where you are safe from the world. And once that becomes dangerous, where do you go?
Right.
We have imperiled children, which is like one of an instinctual fear, and then there's also like the fear of your own family and your neighbors, that they might be someone who they don't say they are,
Right. Well, that's that's always been a draw for me. Like I love haunted house anything. I will watch modern day haunted house stuff, read modern day haunted house stuff, or I especially love the historical Gothic, haunted houses. But I think that is exactly right. It definitely speaks to that idea of your house is your refuge. It's where you feel safe. But in these cases, no, you're not safe. So where do you go? If you can't be at your house, you have to figure out, well, now where do I go? Which often becomes a conflict for my characters is, I can't go home. I can't go back there. So I have to figure out where am I going to stay, and, how am I going to keep my children safe, or how am I going to, get through this and live through this. So that's, these are definitely, I think you're right. It addresses the primal fears that we have as people of safety issues, and trying to protect your family.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. I'd like to thank you so much for coming to discuss your book with me and our listeners.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate it. And it was great talking to you.
Oh, thank you. This has been Jenn with Turn the Page podcast, in discussion with London Clarke, author of Dunmoor, which is a Gothic masterpiece that is beautiful and haunting and a really good fun time. It is now time to close this chapter.
it's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.